Welcome back. Let's wrap up with part two. And this is something you should be familiar with from other classes you've taken, or perhaps just outside reading you've done. Pretty famous. This is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, I used to be fairly skeptical myself about this hierarchy until I realized that this is not from the perspective of an outsider. Hierarchy is how the person, him or herself, thinks about their situation. It's not about how we might view it. So, for example, you might say that a firefighter who has a very dangerous occupation, could that person ever be self-actualized, given that their safety is always at risk? And the answer is yes, because they feel well trained, and from their perspective, they feel in control. They don't feel unsafe because they feel that they can rely on their training and that they are in control, essentially, of their safety issues. So it's from the perspective of each person, not an outsider looking at somebody else. And if you think about it that way, I think this will kind of make sense to you. If you remember, if those of you who've never come across this before, physiological needs have to be met before you worry about safety. Physiological and safety needs have to be met before you worry about belongingness. Those three have to be met before you can start worrying about self-esteem or your own esteem, and the esteem of those around you and the esteem you're held by others. And finally, at the very top is self-actualization. Actually, some people say there's a state above that called transcendency, but most pyramids just stop at self-actualization. So there's a possibility of reaching the self-actualized state. And that's pretty much, if you want to find a definition of self-actualization, it's pretty easy to go online. But basically, people who are comfortable with themselves and productive and their relationships. If you think about it, it's basically the sum of all the stuff below. If you've gotten all of those things, you can essentially be contemplative. You can be somebody who appreciates life. You can be somebody who appreciates other people, and your productivity level will be high, and so on. So that's the triangle, but it's you can see how that kind of thinking influenced how we view workplace relations. And so you'll see that, and you'll see this the sort of human relations information and findings from the Hawthorne studies and how those impacted all later models. By the way, this little piece over here from chapter 16, you can kind of ignore that. That's just because I sometimes borrow slides and input from other sources. So Douglas McGregor, as the sort of humanistic assumptions started having their influence, and started trying to separate older ways of doing things, new way of doing things, and called it Theory X and Theory Y. And the assumptions about relationships are what's critical. Those are the things that have changed. The older models, you can see on the left, workers hate work. They're there because they have to be there. They'll avoid it if possible. As you can see, it's kind of cynical and it's kind of a sour view of the workforce. If you didn't coerce workers, they wouldn't do anything. If you weren't always standing over their shoulder watching them, they would slack off all the time. And if you didn't threaten them with punishment or being fired, then they would never do anything. They actually prefer to be told what to do, and they hate responsibility, little ambition, and so on. That was the older model. It's called Theory X. Theory Y is a little bit, McGregor said, this seems to be the direction we're heading, and you see a lot of this now in a lot of workplace relationship information or training programs. The assumption, workers actually like their workplace and the work they do. Not always, but often. They are self-directing and self-controlling if you give them that opportunity. They will seek responsibility if you give them the opportunity. They know that it's possible for them to actually get some responsibility. They can be imaginative. They can be creative. They can have some intellectual input. And if you think about that, think of the job that is the most basic in the world. Let's say in our part of the world, it's in the Northwest, for example, there are migrant workers who pick fruit. Now, that doesn't seem like a very uplifting occupation. So how do you deal with that? Somebody has to pick the fruit. So how would you deal with that? Well, the actual picking of the fruit may not be something disliked. It's a question of whether or not people who do that job feel like they have some control over the process. They have they are being held to a standard of responsibility that's not coercive. that they can have input into how that's done. Because guess what? They're doing it. Maybe they have some suggestions. Maybe they have some input because they've had experience doing that. And so that's the intellectual piece. So even somebody in what you might consider the sort of very, very basic jobs, they might have something to say about how that job is done. Perhaps it's the custodian at your workplace. If you work in a building, maybe they have some say in whether a particular product is actually effective, cleaning product. So perhaps you're, as the manager, you're buying the cheapest cleaning product ever, and so they're using twice as much of it, and they tell you that. And they feel like when they tell you that, they're actually contributing. They're saving the organization some funds, they're saving time, they're being responsible, and that's an intellectual input that they're making. Yes, you can buy this cheap cleaner, but it takes we have to use twice as much to make it work. And so you're better off getting a little bit more expensive cleaner, which we use less of. And so it's that kind of that. So even in the most basic jobs, there can be that kind of intellectual input on process, products, things that are, perhaps even scheduling. If they say, well, we get most of our time is spent from this hour to this hour doing this, and we adjusted that to another time, we might be more efficient. So there's a lot of intellectual input, even in the most basic of occupations. So few companies still use Theory X, many more trying. In fact, I think you'll find elements of Theory Y in most organizations these days. Theory X is something that people fall back on, and that's something, again, I saw in the crash of 07-08 with a lot of my students who are employees of a lot of companies. When times are tough, sometimes managers will revert back to that sort of authoritarian style, and they become more cynical, and a lot more clipboards, a lot more stopwatches as they watch employees and time how long they spend in the bathroom, and really kind of oppressive things. And it doesn't probably, well, the evidence, when I say probably, it doesn't at all affect productivity, except perhaps negatively, and it affects turnover. So if you've got people trained to do a job and you use an authoritarian procedure with them, and it gets worse when times are tough, guess what? It's the good people who leave. Okay? The employees that you don't think are very good, the marginal ones, the ones who maybe do fall under the cynicism of Theory Y, and again, that's a minority, they'll hang on because they need the job. But the ones who are good, the ones who are willing to step up and do that sort of this sort of Theory Y oriented employee, those are the ones who leave first when times are tough and management becomes a little too authoritarian. Doesn't take advantage of the skills and knowledge they bring to bear. The behavioral sciences approach, again, this is not a new approach. It builds on that sort of humanistic orientation, but it adds the scientific piece. The fact that you still have to collect data, you still have to, you have to manage process, you have to manage employees in terms of their productivity. So you don't surrender that simply because you're also getting input from employees. You still have to look at productivity issues. You still have to look at work hours. All those things have to be, but they're done objectively, and that's what the scientific method brings. Remember, science is not what you study, it's how you study it. So the science, if it says science, like in the social sciences, then we're talking about applying the scientific method, which is an attempt to be objective about all the data that's available in terms of employee input, output of the organization, its productivity, the services it's delivering, and so on. So it's a matter of actually having an understanding of data, and so that's the behavioral sciences input into management, and it joins up nicely with the humanistic perspective, which is a little less data based, but it turns out they work hand in hand. Some people say that organizational development as a training program, it captures that element, and the org sciences program at the University of Idaho is essentially an OD, or organizational development kind of program. Management science, again, adding more and more of the scientific perspective. Mainly in the 50s, we started seeing this applied fairly rigorously, and still is. Statistics, other quantitative techniques, are things measurable? Mostly things are, right? And in fact, in organizations, it jumps out at you how measurable these things are. I mean, in sort of clinical counseling disciplines, it's harder, but when dealing with organizations, you always have output. You have the input, which is things like what are the organization's costs? You have the output, what are the returns? Whether it's in terms of development money and nonprofits, but also funds for services rendered. And so you have all of that in place. And so it's a matter of evaluating that information. And there are training programs that will help you do that. In bigger organizations, they'll be offices in the organization that will do operations research and operations management, and will have ITS or information technology services. Smaller organizations, you'll have to keep the mindset to do some of this yourself, right? To take into account the data that's available and to look at how effective your organization really is. Systems theory is, again, something that combines sort of the humanistic approaches and the scientific approaches, and tries to coordinate them a little bit better. And so there's, realizing that, as you get into larger organizations, you have layers and layers of these systems, and that they can communicate with each other. And so you get up and down the layers of the organization as well as laterally. The contingency view is again just an elaboration. TQM is something you probably have heard about because total quality management was pretty trendy, but if you think about it as I do, as nothing more than the natural outcome of theory Y thinking, then it shouldn't be a mystery to you. It's become almost a fad, but in fact it's based on the sound principles that come from theory Y. That is, you seek input and involvement, engagement from the workforce, because they're the ones on the front line doing the job, and that you measure, right? Total quality management is a matter of not only giving control and responsibility down to the lower levels of your organization, but also collecting data from those levels working up. And it doesn't mean you surrender control. It just means that you manage that control, and you do it objectively. So you try and take biases, personal grudges, those kinds of things have to be taken out of the system as much as possible. Here's a little bit of that systems approach, and you can see the elements of theory Y in it clearly. But what's captured here, I think, is the feedback loop. That's what systems theory has a little bit of a link to cybernetics, right? In the sense that almost everything involves feedback. You start with the basic element of, even at the cellular level. In psychology and neuroscience, we talk about feedback systems, but certainly at the organizational and systems level, feedback is the critical piece. So you've got the inputs any organization may have: raw materials, information, human resources, financial resources. You have the actual production services, the mission of the organization essentially is in the middle, and then this is what the output is. It's of course the very direct issues associated with profits, losses, or in nonprofit organizations, the cost for services or developmental returns on investment. So I mean, remember, nonprofits are make profit; they just reinvest them in the organization and its services, and sort of the output of those products and services and so on. And of course, employee satisfaction has to be considered part of that output, right? Because that matters. And again, that's something that the newer theories take into account. Employees are agents, and they can leave, and they require investment themselves. And so you take advantage of what they can contribute, and if they are contributors, then that's part of the feedback system. And you can see that all of this, which is fairly obvious, but then this too, whether your employees are satisfied in the workplace, feeds back into and becomes part of the human resources that you're contributing to process. Okay. Learning organizations, again, this is not these kinds of approaches are not independent of one another. They can overlap. They can all be used at the same time, or at least kept in the back of your mind as if you become a supervisor or manager. So again, you can see the elements of those older approaches, right? You've got employees who are empowered. Their input is sought. Their advice is taken when it makes sense, when it's practicable. They're at least given some responsibility for the final outcomes and services and that are provided. Right? Um, the structure is more of a team-based one rather than a hierarchical one, and they're fairly open in a lot of organizational systems. Pretty open in terms of what people understanding what the process is, what other shops are doing, and in that kind of older X model, which it wasn't on the previous slide, but you get that sense that I think in the supervisors 100 years ago didn't care that one shop didn't know, didn't have any input into what another shop within that organization was doing. These days we know that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If I'm going to be an effective player, I want to know what the whole organization's up to. If I want to have enthusiasm for the final product, I want to know what the adjacent sub-organizations or shops within my larger organization are doing. I want to take pride in the overall accomplishment of the organization, not just my little corner of it. And so, in fact, you see some of that actually in the military these days, and that's also a little bit different. But you find military, which is a large hierarchical organization, and it kind of has to have a little more hierarchy than a lot of organizations simply because chain of command matters so much. But you find a lot more. I mean, there are clearly things that are information that has to be kept secure. But you find a lot more teamwork in the military, and it's that understanding that I may have to know what my other teammates are doing for me to be effective. Right? So, and that means sharing information. So, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the specifics that we would spend time on if this was a full one-semester course in human relations in the workplace. And that's all I'm going to ask you to think about today, is not all the specific findings in each of these areas, but that these are things that you should pay attention to if you are a supervisor or a manager. So it's to be alert, to be open to paying attention to these kinds of issues. To some of my classes, when we have org sciences students coming in to get a degree in this area, one of the things I try to remind them is, it's not even a reminder, for some of them it's the first time they've heard this. They have to learn to think organizationally. And in light of all the stuff I've been talking about with respect to human relations, it's a matter of being aware of and alert to and of the human relations and issues in the workplace. We're not passive in the workplace. We're not riding on the organizations we belong to. I think that's the way a lot of people look at it, is like a bus you get on. You become a member of an organization, you get on the bus and you sit in the back, and then eventually you're at your destination. And you can't think about it that way. You have to think of it as a driver of the bus. You have to think that everybody's contributing. Even if somebody's at the wheel, maybe you have other people saying, well, I got to stop now, or here's the right road. Everybody has to be engaged in organizations. And so I want you, as we go through this list of things that typically we cover in human relations, to think that at this stage, your job is primarily to be paying attention to these aspects of the workplace. And that's a good start. That's not the full course in this area, but paying attention is critical. You'll find that that's a good portion of the whole effort of understanding human relations in the workplace, is just, if you're in the workplace itself, to pay attention to the issues that we'll talk about right now. So the first thing you want to think about, and all of you have been in organizations perhaps where you know what I'm talking about because this is personal for you, right? Is you want an organization that pays attention to the personal success of all of its members. And that means taking advantage of people's emotional intelligence to do judicious goal setting for your workers and coworkers and even supervisors, to give them reasonable targets, to make sure that there's continuous learning going on in the workplace for them. In some organizations, they call it employee development, right? That is, you should be in a position in the workplace where the people who are working for you, if you're a supervisor, can better themselves. That means they may leave, but that's success for you. right? When somebody is so good that they actually can move on, don't look at that as a loss. Look at that as a gain. You have, because until they leave, you have improved their circumstances, and that means you have improved your outcomes. And so, yeah, they will turn over because they will move up, they'll move laterally, they'll find something that perhaps better suits them. But hopefully, the reluctance they have to leave will be because they love your organization and they've enjoyed the work time they put in, they appreciate the mission of the organization, and so they'll be reluctant to leave. But you've made them better. And sometimes they actually will just move up in your own organization. That'd be great, right? So you have to look at those kinds of things as successes, even though there's an interruption and there's a training issue. But if you've done your job well and you've engaged those people and taken advantage of what they bring to the workplace, you'll find that you actually get them longer than you realize, simply because they appreciate the space that the workplace spaces and training and development that you've done for them. You need to manage your own stress as well as your workers, the people you supervise, coworkers, and that's a matter of paying attention. When you see productivity waver, look for the things that might have affected that. Don't always assume that it's because that's not a good worker, it's not a good supervisee that you have. It could be that there are things happening to that person, and it's a good manager will seek to find out what those issues might be, and perhaps even offer an intervention or some relief that gets people through that. Remember, if you do that, you actually can save yourself money. In the case of an organization where you might be on thin margins, that's important. If you salvage somebody who is in a moment of stress because of a situational issue, but is otherwise a good worker, a good coworker, you've actually saved yourself training costs, you've saved yourself downtime, you've actually improved that person's life as well. So it's not your stress is better because their stress is better. Your stress is better because you've managed to get an employee through a tough time who is a valuable employee. So pay attention to those kinds of issues. There'll usually be something that tells you, sometimes they'll tell you themselves, but sometimes there's something else that you'll see. You'll see it from coworkers, they'll report it to you. You'll see it in productivity. You'll see it in sort of workplace habits. And so be vigilant and aware of those kinds of issues. And pay attention to your own stress levels. If you are feeling stressed, there's something going on in your organization that needs to be dealt with. And now some jobs will never be out of stress. All right, if you are a firefighter and you have to go to the work, you have to go to fires, there's stress built in. Police officers, military people who work in emergency rooms, there's always stress. And then it's a matter of managing it. You're not going to get rid of it, but at least get to where you can handle it, give yourself breaks from it, help you decompress from very tough moments. So build in systems that permit that. Otherwise, you'll walk away, and people that you work with who are under those same kinds of stresses will walk away. Burnout is a real problem in stressful occupations, and it's very costly. So keep that in mind. It's a matter of, again, being vigilant, looking for that. Sometimes the stress is artificial, and that's what you have to watch for as well. The stress that you get between two people in your workplace who maybe just don't get along. And that's a management issue, right? That's your job if you're a supervisor, is to deal with that level of conflict and make sure that it doesn't spill over into other people and into the process, the mission, the services you provide, and so on. Communication. We'll spend a lot of time in a class like this on communication, how to communicate effectively. And again, at this stage, it's a matter of you noticing that communication matters. As you go back and think and work in your organizations or join an organization, look at the communication patterns there. Could they be more efficient? Does everything have to go through a gatekeeper? Is everything so hierarchical that you can't get through to somebody higher up the hierarchy without people in between getting in the way of your message? And is the message from the top being adequately communicated down through supervisors to you if you're in the trenches of the workplace? Right? So look for those kinds of issues. Our instructions, training, is change in process information, is that getting down to the people in the trenches? Is their feedback getting back up? In an organization that requires moment-to-moment communication among coworkers, is that happening effectively, and so on. Nonverbal communication matters. I won't go into that now, but most of you know that nonverbal communication is powerful, and I'll leave that to you to look at for at other settings. And written communication. People forget that memos can be ambiguous, and if they're ambiguous, then it can change the way people react and can affect productivity and services. So, written communication, memos, notes, and email. Email, you remember, email was supposed to go away, and we would all be twittering or and texting. And no, the real advantage of email is that it's archival. That every time you send an email, there's a copy of it, and you can go back and look at it, and you can track trails and so on. And so it's never going to go away, but it could be done better. Right? People have to be careful with email, to be explicit, make sure there's no confusion, ambiguous messages or information being shared. The written communication, pretty much email is now much more common than, say, paper memos, but it's still written, it's still the written word, and there's still concerns and issues about ambiguity. And of course, the written word does not sometimes show the emotional content of what's written, and so you have to be cautious about that. Emails can seem harsh when they weren't sent by somebody who was in a harsh mood, because they were being blunt, but maybe they had a smile on their face when they're typing it, but it doesn't show up in the message itself. So you have to be cautious about those kinds of things. Emoticons can help, but it could be that just appropriate phrasing will get you through those kinds of issues. Public speaking, not so much. I think I didn't want to pass by and not mention public speaking. By public speaking, we're not necessarily talking about speeches, but speaking to groups in training sessions, in organizational meetings. It's how you present yourself, how you present the organization, and it is important, right? So you have to, and how you represent the organization to outside constituents like the press or donor groups in the case of a nonprofit, or stockholders in the case of a for-profit. So those public speaking strategies have to be something that you have to consider. You may never find yourself in a position where that's part of what you do, but I'll bet you'll find at least some element of that. There are moments when you'll have to speak to some subgroups within your organization in a sort of a semi-public way, and so having good training there is probably not a bad idea. But again, this is a matter of paying attention to those things, the communication channels, the communication ambiguity or lack of clarity, the messages people say by how they dress and how they posture, the nonverbal things. So there's all things that can be paid attention to and can have an impact on the organization's effectiveness. Ethical decision making. People in your organization will know when the ethical compass, so to speak, in the organization is a little askew. So it's a matter of being responsible, because you want the best employees are ethical employees, and they want to work for an organization that is ethical, and they want an organization that's socially responsible, that takes into account damage that may be done by the organization's decisions, or the good that could be done. Right? Social responsibility isn't always about not doing something. Sometimes it's a matter of stepping up and doing something proactively, pro-socially. So people want to work for organizations like that. They want to know that they're making a difference in a positive way. And it's everyday ethics as well. One of the things, and I put soft skills here because that's another course we teach, and that was actually a request from our community that we sort of include modules on soft skills, because soft skills is about training ethics in organizations, and not the only part of soft skills training, but we were told by a lot of managers who came to us as we were developing degree programs and said, that's what's missing in our community, is we need a little bit more of an emphasis on the soft skills. And that's everyday ethics, like don't do this, don't pollute your stream, don't fire people needlessly when over personal issues instead of performance issues. Those are ethical issues. But soft skills is like your personal responsibility as well. The soft skills are those are the ethical guidelines each worker or person within the organization sets for themselves. I will be on time. I will dress appropriately for my workplace. I will, understand my place in the overall hierarchy and have respect for the people who are work with me and so on. So those are soft skills, and that's so it's not just the ethics of the organization, but the ethics of each person in the organization. And soft skills captures that. What is each person's personal ethics and responsibility with respect to their job and their coworkers? Human motivation. We actually, again, we deal with that with a special course on what things motivate workers, and of course salary does. But again, it's not the only thing, and that's if you hearken back to what we talked about with respect to the humanistic approach or the Hawthorne movement theory, why employees are motivated not just by salary, but by the other things that they may be able to contribute. There are a lot of people who will work at a place for lesser money because they like their coworkers, they like the process, they feel like they're trusted, they feel like their input matters. They have some flexibility in the organization to go to people in positions of responsibility to make their voices heard without being treated badly, and so on. So think about the motivations people have for a job. And a lot of you are in nonprofits. And this is especially something that you should pay attention to. People go to nonprofits and work for nonprofits specifically because they're motivated by the mission of those nonprofits. It could be in the arts, could be in human services, medical field, educational field, and even religious. A lot of religious organizations operate like nonprofits, and although they're technically slightly different, but they are people work in those organizations because they're motivated to work there in the first place. So use that, and it's not a substitute for compensation, but you will find that people, if their personal values, intentions, and if their intellectual capabilities and their engagement, natural engagement in the workplace, if those things are taken advantage of, then you'll have motivated employees, motivated coworkers. And of course, any organization, by definition, is a matter of group process. People have to work effectively in groups, and there's a fair amount of material covered in team building, team performance, understanding the natural cycles of groups, the fact that groups, when they're, especially task forces, when they're often created for a very special task, and they have cycles. And so a task force, that's okay, because task force, usually when the task is done, the group dissolves. But in organizations where the task is never done because it's ongoing, like building cars or providing certain kinds of services, you don't end typically, you keep doing that. And so you have to find ways of refreshing these sort of natural group cycles. And so it's understanding, the groups. Otherwise, you'll find in the workplace that the groups will kind of lose their edge over time. And so you can keep a group having a sharp edge by paying attention to the cycles and refreshing the members and reinvigorating them. It's a matter of paying attention. It could be, for example, in adjusting group roles, adjusting membership here and there, changing team leadership here and there, and so on. It's taking advantage of natural group processes. Decision making is mostly made by groups, especially in modern organizations, because that's a good thing. That's one of the advantages of the sort of modern human relations movement in organizations, theory Y, and the sort of modern systems approaches. Like, decision making is not centralized in a single individual or two. The whole point is to engage others at all levels, and so decision making has to be considered in most organizations to be group if not done by the group, at least influenced by group membership. So that works well in many cases. There are risks. Brainstorming is a great way to generate ideas. Groupthink can be damaging. So it's paying attention to group process, how groups make decision making better, but also there's some risks associated with it. So it's understanding what the risks are and the advantages are, and also managing the group itself. Groups can devolve into chatting, become less productive because they're all chatting about the ball game, right? So that requires a little management on the person who's leading the group at the time, or multiple leaders in some cases. And so it's a matter of managing group process, making sure you don't let the group process get out of hand, as happens in groupthink, but taking advantage of the fact that you're bringing a lot of viewpoints to the table by bringing many individuals to the table. So you get different ideas. Things that you may not have thought about, somebody else may have thought about that. Things that seem to be going just perfectly for you, it turns out maybe not so much, and as you learn from one of your teammates. All right, so it's taking advantage of the different perspectives you bring to bear and making sure that you don't let the group process get out of hand, or that you don't get a kind of a groupthink mentality. Groupthink mentality, by the way, is something that most of you are familiar with, but just in case, it's when the members of the group start defending the status quo. And so the ideas and thoughts generated are protective of either a authoritarian leader or the process itself. And so you don't get the one contribution that may avert a disaster. Usually the Challenger disaster is given as a sort of organizational example of groupthink. But you've all participated in it. You've seen it happen, right? Nobody will say, for example, with a strong, powerful leader, that nobody wants to contradict the powerful leader or the powerful process within the organization. So so good ideas sometimes don't get contributed because of that, and so it's something to watch for. A good leader, that very powerful person, for example, knows to him or herself not let that happen. To say, okay, I need to hear the bad news as well as the good news. Conflict is inevitable, and you have to think of it as nothing happens unless there's conflict. The key is to manage it. Conflict means that it starts very simply as people disagreeing, and it could be they disagree with each other, it could be they disagree with the current process in your organization, and you can push that person aside, or you can say, well, let's see what we can take from that person. And so it could be that conflict is what stimulates a change in process that actually improves your bottom line, improves your services, and so on. So you have to understand conflict as something that is necessary for change. There are lots of causes, there are lots of potential outcomes, but you have to have it if you want change to occur at all. So again, the key is not to eliminate conflict, but to manage the conflict. So conflict can be respectful, right? In the sense that two conflicting parties can discuss things with respect and come to common understanding or common ground, or at least present both sides and feel that they both been able to have their input. So you don't want to smother conflict. What you want to do is manage it. In a case where you've not managed, and negotiation is a means of managing conflict, of course, if you've not managed it, then what you have to worry about is the conflict spiral, and that is that as conflicts grow, then people who are conflicting parties will start gathering allies, and they'll start deepening the conflict, so it becomes a little bit more harsh, a little bit more personal. And so if you let it get out of hand, that's what happens. Typically more people get involved, it gets to be more personal, it gets to be more harmful. And so when you get to a certain point where that's what you see, where you've got people who were never involved in the original conflict are now seem to be involved in it, if you've got personal people making personal claims about others, then you know the conflict has probably gotten out of hand. And sometimes it'll have to just work its way out. It'll just, a good manager might be able to break it up by breaking up the parties involved, but because they brought allies and it's become a lot more personal, sometimes it take, even after you remove the warring parties, sometimes the atmospherics linger. So it's good to avoid it if you get to that level of conflict. So try to intervene and make it useful, and then avoid the deepening of the conflict. You've seen this happen before. That's why it's sometimes called a spiral. It gets wider at the top as you spiral around and around, and people don't realize how fast they got into the conflict, the deadly part of the conflict, the kind of unpleasant and personal part of the conflict. They don't realize when it happened. All of a sudden, they seem to be in it. That's what that spiral captures. It's at any point on a spiral, the next level doesn't seem so high, but you keep spiraling, and the next thing you know, you've moved up, quite far on the spiral, and then it gets wider and wider at the top, has more and more parties. So if you're in a conflict with somebody in your workplace, for example, one of the things you do is find an ally. You want somebody else. You want to bring other people in, and that's, again, when you see a conflict where that has happened, where it's spread beyond the original conflicting parties, where it's become emotional and personal, it's probably too late, and you're just going to have to intervene directly. That could be removing parties. It could be isolating people. There are all kinds of things that will work there. Sometimes you just have to create an outstanding event that forces people to come back together, a common emergency. Or sometimes there's a naturally occurring common emergency that will bring people back. But it's very difficult. Often these things will play themselves out. The warring parties finally leave, they're gone, or at least one of them's gone. They've changed organizations. They've had to be terminated. Who knows what happened? But the two original parties may be gone, or at least one of them. And then some natural processes will take place. One thing that serves you is that conflict is unpleasant. People don't want it. The people who got involved in the conflict inadvertently because it happened to expand around them, it's unpleasant. And so that's one of the things. If your job is to try and diffuse the conflict in your organization, one of the things you can take advantage of is the fact that a lot of people engaged in it are looking for a way out. Conflict can cost you. It costs resources, and that's another incentive for people to get out of it. Is say, well, I don't have time. My life is too short. We don't have the resources in the organization, and we're losing productivity. And so you will find some things that will help you get out of the conflict, even if it gets very severe, and just learn to take advantage of those resources. The fact that if people are tired, people don't want to live that way, and those are things that you might find useful. And there are some ethical issues associated with conflict. You always have to keep those in mind, that the conflict may have occurred because some people have acted unethically, and another person has stood up. So there may be, if you're a supervisor or manager, you may have to weigh the sources of the conflict, and that will help you to make a decision about how to act. And so just be cautious about that. Not every conflict is equal. The ones where you have a debate about process, those are the kinds of conflicts that might be useful, that you can manage. You can take advantage of the outcomes of that and then move on. But you get ones that are about somebody who feels that somebody else is acting badly or acting unethically, then you may need a direct intervention a little bit earlier in the process. There are, of course, cross-cultural issues you find, and by the way, even regional issues. Even in a country as big as the U.S., you find people in conflicted situations because they're from different parts of the same nation. So it's cross-cultural. There are ethnic issues. There are religious issues. There are all kinds of ways that people can find themselves in conflicted situations, and just be aware of those and notice those and try to diffuse the ones you can. And the key is, again, to get people to respect each other. Workplace diversity is, of course, the legal issues. And I want to stay away from the legal issues for now, because those you'll find in most organizations. They'll be printed in your personnel policy manuals, or you'll find it posted somewhere, and they're very real, and so those are certainly important. But I think from the perspective of human relations in the workplace, I think the piece that we would add here beyond the legal issues is that a workplace should represent the customer base, or the people who are being served. And if you think of that, then I think you'll see that there's certain bottom line advantages to having a diverse workforce. It is not just a legal issue, it's also a matter of it being, in some cases, in many cases, good practice. If you've got customers that are diverse, then having an organization that represents that customer base, or that's the people who are being served, is a good thing. It serves your employees. It also serves the people that you're providing services to or products to. And so it's there that the dual purposes. It's a lot of organizations out there, for profits and nonprofits, have decided to have diverse workforces for that reason, because it kind of improves their bottom line and improves their ability to deliver services. It's not just a matter of being hammered by the law, and that's something that you need to keep in the back of your mind as you think about the workforce that you have. Leadership, there are whole classes in leadership, and so I don't want to say so much now, because there'll be another module taught by others on leadership, and they will cover things like this. But it is the kind of topic that we do cover in human relations course. We'll spend a little time on management styles, the relationship between task managers and relationship-oriented managers, and the fact that most good managers will have a little elements of both. The kind of organization has to matter in terms of your leadership style. The problem with charismatic leaders who sometimes have charisma but aren't really terribly effective. Not every charismatic leader is actually a good leader. And the difference between leadership and management. Anybody can manage. You can be trained to do nuts and bolts management, but leadership involves something else. It's that extra piece that involves inspiring, changing, and that's, for example, that couple slides ago when I talked about employee development, or helping employees become better than they are, and getting to them perhaps to a place where they actually move on because they're now better employees and better skilled workers than they used to be. That's leadership. Management is, okay, you do your job and then you go away. Management is the kind of thing you expect with Theory X. Theory Y is leadership. That's when you actually inspire, when you help employees better themselves, when you have people focusing on mission, not each other and themselves. When you have, so leadership is a little bit more than management, and that's an important distinction, and that's the way you need to think of it. And anything more on that, I think I should probably just leave for our instructors who deal with that leadership class, and let you cover it there. Of course, again, it'll be a module that you'll see in the Org Sciences Human Relations class as well. All right, so that gives you an idea. Again, the last pieces here, what are the specifics, right? That is, pay attention. If you can learn nothing else from this short module, these two videos, you've got a little bit of history, but then don't let these things be just passive aspects of your workplace. Right? These are things that you should pay attention to if you're in an organization as a leader, or even as a staffer, or if you're down in the trenches of your organization. Pay attention to these things. Personal success of you and the people around you, your stress, and your coworkers' stress. Communication channels, patterns, clarity, ambiguity, ethics, personal ethics of each worker, their responsibility of the workplace, and the overall responsibility, social responsibility of the organization. Motivation, which includes, of course, compensation, but also the engagement of the workers that you have with you. Dealing with group process and how groups are different than individuals, how they have groups that have a life cycle, and how that sometimes has to be refreshed periodically. Decision making, groupthink, the good aspects of group decision making and the bad aspects of group decision making, and that groups themselves make decisions because they talk to each other. That's what group process is. Understanding conflict, managing it, dealing with conflicts that get out of control, but taking advantage of conflicts initially because that's where change originates. Culture, ethnicity of both you and your workforce and the constituents and people you serve, and leadership. Leadership being much more than management, taking into consideration the kind of organization you have and what that organization is supposed to do. Right? Okay, thank you.